People think the night that changes your life begins with a grand confession or a dramatic goodbye. Mine started with a weather report that got everything wrong. If anyone had told me that a routine weekend trip with my best friend would redraw every line I thought I understood about us, I would have laughed, grabbed another cup of gas station coffee, and kept driving. That's exactly what I was doing as our old pickup rolled north through the winding mountain roads of western North Carolina. The dashboard clock read 2:17 p.m., classic rock drifted softly through worn speakers, and rain clouds gathered in the distance like lazy spectators waiting for something neither of us expected. Nolan Whitmore sat behind the wheel with one hand resting casually at the top of the steering wheel, his other elbow balanced against the open window. He always drove the same way, calm, steady, like nothing in the world could surprise him. As a structural engineer, he trusted measurements, calculations, and facts. He believed every problem had a solution if you looked at it long enough. I envied that about him. I was the opposite. As a wildlife photographer, I spent my life chasing moments that couldn't be planned, waiting hours for sunlight to fall just right or for an eagle to spread its wings exactly once. Somewhere between his certainty and my chaos, we'd built a friendship that had somehow survived 15 years. "You're staring again," Nolan said without taking his eyes off the road. I blinked. "At the mountains?" "Sure you are." A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You always make that face when you're pretending to appreciate nature." "I literally photograph nature for a living." "Exactly. Occupational hazard." I rolled my eyes and reached for the bag of barbecue chips between us. "You know, you're a lot funnier in your own head. Good thing I spend plenty of time there." We both laughed, the kind that came easily after years of shared history. We'd met in 7th grade after getting assigned as science partners, survived awkward teenage years, first apartments, career failures, family losses, and enough terrible dating stories to fill an entire podcast. Somewhere along the way, Nolan had become less like a friend and more like gravity. Constant, reliable, always there, whether I deserved it or not. This trip wasn't supposed to be sentimental. My grandfather's cabin had sat empty for almost 3 years after he passed away. The realtor needed us to clean it out before listing it, and Nolan had volunteered before I could even ask. Somebody has to stop you from throwing away tax documents and keeping broken fishing poles because they feel nostalgic, he'd joked. He wasn't wrong. Sentiment had always been my weakness. We rounded another curve, and the first heavy raindrops splattered across the windshield. Nolan flipped on the wipers. "Forecast said scattered showers," he muttered. "Looks heavier than that." Weather apps are wrong half the time. Usually not by much. The farther we climbed, the darker the sky became. The bright summer afternoon slowly disappeared beneath thick charcoal clouds that swallowed every patch of blue. Wind bent the pine trees along the ridges, their branches swaying harder than they should have in early August. I reached for my phone out of habit. One lonely bar of service blinked before disappearing completely. "Guess we're officially off the grid." Nolan nodded. "Cabin should be another 15 minutes. A crack of thunder echoed somewhere far above us, low enough to vibrate through the truck. I forced myself not to react. I'd hated thunderstorms since I was a kid, though I'd gotten pretty good at pretending otherwise. Nolan never seemed to notice. Or maybe he was simply kind enough not to mention it. Another flash lit the horizon for half a second before fading behind the clouds. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It never had been. But for reasons I couldn't explain, it suddenly felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something neither of us could see coming. The cabin appeared through the curtain of rain like an old memory, refusing to disappear. Its cedar siding looked darker than I remembered. The front porch sagged just enough to remind me that time never skipped a place simply because people stopped visiting it, and the weathered rocking chair my grandfather used every evening still faced the valley below, as if he had only stepped inside for a minute. Nolan parked beside the gravel driveway and killed the engine. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the sky cracked open again. Thunder rolled across the mountains with enough force to rattle the windshield. "That sounded closer," Nolan said quietly. "Very observant," I replied, forcing a smile that probably convinced neither of us. The rain hit the roof in heavy sheets while we hurried toward the porch carrying backpacks over our heads. By the time Nolan unlocked the front door with the spare key I had found in my grandfather's toolbox, Both of us were damp around the shoulders. The cabin greeted us with the familiar scent of aged pine, fireplace ash, and old books that had spent decades absorbing every season. Dust floated lazily through the dim afternoon light, filtering between closed curtains. It felt strangely comforting, like stepping into a photograph that had somehow learned to breathe. Still standing, Nolan said, setting his duffel bag beside the couch. I told you it would be. I never doubted the cabin. I doubted your definition of organized maintenance. That hurts. He laughed softly before walking toward the windows to check the locks. I wandered into the kitchen, running my fingertips across the worn oak counter where my grandfather used to make pancakes every Saturday morning. Some places carried memories so naturally that they did not need photographs to remind you. They simply existed in the walls. Another burst of thunder interrupted the quiet. This one landed so suddenly that every window trembled for an instant. I instinctively froze, my shoulders tightening before I realized I had stopped breathing. Calm down, Caleb. It is only weather. You are 27 years old, not 7. I busied myself unpacking canned soup and bottled water onto the counter, pretending the slight shake in my hands came from the cold mountain air instead of something much older. Nolan returned from checking the back door. Power is still on. That is a good sign. Almost as if the storm had been listening, every light inside the cabin blinked once, then twice. Then everything disappeared. The refrigerator hummed into silence. The ceiling fan stopped mid-turn. Only the steady drumming of rain remained. Nolan sighed. I spoke too soon. Please tell me you packed flashlights. Instead of answering, he unzipped his backpack and produced 2 heavy-duty camping lanterns with the satisfied expression of someone who enjoyed being prepared. Engineer, he said simply. Warm yellow light slowly filled the living room, pushing back the darkness gathering outside the windows. It should have made me feel better. Instead, the storm only seemed louder now that the cabin itself had gone quiet. Wind whistled beneath the porch roof. Tree branches scraped gently against the siding. Somewhere outside, something metallic clanged again and again in uneven rhythm. Nolan glanced toward the front window. We should probably stay here tonight, even if the rain lets up. Those mountain roads are not safe after dark. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed for exactly half a second as one weak signal appeared. A weather alert flashed across the screen before disappearing almost immediately. Severe thunderstorm warning. Flash flooding possible. Avoid travel. Then the signal vanished again. I looked toward Nolan. He had seen my expression before I even spoke. Bad, he asked. I nodded once. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room through every window at the same time, bright enough to erase every shadow for a heartbeat. The thunder that followed was so immediate that my body reacted before my mind could stop it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. I hoped Nolan had not noticed. Unfortunately, Nolan had always noticed more than I realized. Nolan leaned against the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, watching me with the same expression he used whenever he was trying to solve a problem that refused to cooperate. It was never judgment. It was curiosity wrapped in concern. Caleb, he said gently. You okay? I looked up too quickly. Of course. You grabbed that counter like it personally offended you. It startled me. That was more than being startled. I forced a laugh. That sounded hollow even to my own ears. You have officially become dramatic. Comes with the engineering license. He walked into the kitchen, opened one of the cabinets, and found 2 dusty mugs exactly where my grandfather had always kept them. Somehow that simple act made the cabin feel less empty. He filled a small kettle with bottled water and placed it on the gas stove. Tea, he asked. You hate tea. Tonight feels like a tea night. I smiled despite myself. You really are worried. Maybe a little. The kettle began warming with a soft hiss while rain battered the roof in relentless waves. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, pushing against the cabin walls with long, steady breaths. The place was solid. I knew that. Nolan definitely knew that. Yet storms had a way of making even strong things feel temporary. We carried our mugs into the living room and settled near the stone fireplace, although there was no reason to light it yet. The lantern sitting on the coffee table painted warm circles across the room, while everything beyond its glow dissolved into shadow. Nolan sipped his tea before looking at me again. Can I ask you something? Depends. Since when are you afraid of thunderstorms? My heartbeat skipped. I stared into my mug, watching the steam curl upward like it might offer an escape route. I am not afraid. Another flash exploded outside, followed almost instantly by a crack of thunder that seemed to split the mountain itself. Before I realized what I was doing, my shoulders jumped and my fingers tightened around the mug. Nolan did not say a word. He simply waited. That somehow made it harder to hide. I let out a slow breath. Ever since I was 8. The confession felt strangely heavy after carrying it around for nearly 20 years. My parents were driving home during a storm. We were fine. Nothing happened to us. But lightning hit a huge oak tree right beside the road. I laughed softly at myself. The tree never even landed near the truck. It just scared me so badly that every storm since then feels exactly the same. Nolan nodded without interrupting. It is stupid. No. His answer came immediately. It is a memory. Those things do not always listen to logic. I looked over at him. Funny hearing that from an engineer. He smiled. Engineers know fear is not a math equation. Silence settled between us again, comfortable this time. The kind that had always belonged to us. I leaned back against the couch and watched raindrops race each other down the window. Maybe talking about it had taken away some of its power. Maybe not. Then another deafening burst of thunder slammed across the ridge without warning. My body reacted before my mind had any chance to catch up. I flinched sharply and instinctively reached sideways for something steady. Instead of finding the edge of the couch, my hand caught Nolan's forearm. I froze. So did he. My fingers were still wrapped around his sleeve. I let go so quickly that I nearly spilled my tea. Sorry, I blurted out. I did not mean to. My face burned with embarrassment. Nolan glanced down at the place where I had grabbed him before meeting my eyes again. Instead of teasing me the way he usually would, he gave me the smallest smile. You know, he said quietly, if grabbing my arm makes the storm a little easier, I really do not mind. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Somewhere deep inside, a feeling I had spent years carefully locking away stirred for the very first time, and I suddenly realized I was no longer sure whether it was the thunder making my heart race. I stood up too quickly, mostly because sitting still suddenly felt impossible. My ears were warm, my thoughts refused to stay in one place, and the simple memory of my hand resting on Nolan's arm replayed itself with embarrassing clarity. I wandered toward the hallway under the excuse of checking the bedrooms, hoping a few minutes alone would convince my heartbeat to remember how normal people behaved around their best friend. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar and old laundry soap. Everything looked exactly as my grandfather had left it, except for the thin layer of dust covering every surface. I opened the first bedroom and found the same handmade quilt folded neatly across the bed. The second room held little more than an old dresser and a fishing magazine from years ago. When I reached the linen closet, I smiled. Found something, Nolan called from the living room. Maybe. I carried out a thick wool blanket nearly the size of the couch. Grandpa never threw anything away. Nolan laughed. That thing probably weighs 30 pounds. 30 pounds of excellent life choices. Just then another gust of wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the lantern flicker. The cabin groaned softly, not from weakness but from age, the same way old houses always spoke during bad weather. I unfolded the blanket and immediately realized why my grandfather loved it. It was impossibly warm. Nolan reached out to help spread it across the couch, but halfway through we both stopped. It covered barely enough space for two people sitting close together. Well, he said with a grin, looks like your grandfather believed in efficiency, or he expected people to like each other. Fortunately, we qualify. I rolled my eyes, but the smile came anyway. We settled onto the couch beneath the oversized blanket, shoulders separated by only a few inches. At first it felt strangely formal, like two people trying very hard to pretend nothing about the situation was unusual. I focused on the rain streaking across the windows while Nolan quietly adjusted the edge of the blanket so cold air could not slip underneath. Better, he asked. Much. The warmth spread slowly through my arms and legs. Outside, the storm showed no sign of leaving. Rain hammered the roof with steady determination while the wind swept through the surrounding forest, carrying the whisper of countless pine trees moving together. Normally, I would have found it peaceful. Tonight, every distant rumble still made my muscles tighten before I could stop them. Nolan noticed without saying anything. He simply shifted a little closer, just enough that our shoulders touched through our flannel shirts. It was such a small movement that anyone else might have missed it. Somehow it changed the entire room. "Remember sophomore year?" he asked suddenly. "Which disaster?" "The camping trip." I laughed immediately. "You mean the one where you insisted you could build a fire without instructions?" "It almost worked. You accidentally smoked out half the campground." "Details." The park ranger literally applauded when it finally went out. Nolan covered his face with one hand, laughing so hard the couch shook beneath us. Hearing that familiar laugh loosened something inside me. We spent the next several minutes recalling one ridiculous memory after another. The broken canoe. The failed Thanksgiving pie that somehow tasted like garlic. The road trip where we drove 2 hours in the wrong direction because neither of us wanted to admit the other had better navigation instincts. Every story felt like another thread stitching the evening back together. Somewhere between laughing and listening, I realized the storm had faded into the background. It was still there, loud and relentless beyond the walls, but inside the cabin another sound had taken its place. Nolan's easy voice, the occasional clink of our mugs, the quiet rhythm of two people who had known each other long enough to turn silence into comfort. Then the temperature seemed to drop all at once. I tucked the blanket tighter around my shoulders without thinking. Nolan noticed immediately and pulled one side higher, so it wrapped around both of us more securely. "There," he said softly. "No sense letting you freeze." I looked at him for a moment longer than I intended. The lantern reflected in his blue eyes, warm against the darkness surrounding us. And for the first time all evening, I found myself wondering whether the safest place in the entire cabin had never been the walls around us at all. The clock on the fireplace mantel had stopped years ago at 9:42, but judging by the darkness outside, midnight could not have been far away. Rain still poured without mercy, turning the windows into moving walls of silver, while the wind wandered through the trees with a lonely whistle that rose and faded like distant music. Neither of us seemed interested in checking the time anyway. The cabin had become its own little world, cut off from everything except the sound of the storm and the quiet conversation drifting between us. Nolan stretched his legs beneath the blanket and let out a content sigh. I forgot how peaceful this place can be. I raised an eyebrow. Peaceful is not the word I would choose tonight. Fair point. He smiled into his mug before setting it on the coffee table. Still better than sitting in traffic back in Charlotte. Everything is better than sitting in traffic in Charlotte. That earned another laugh, and for a while we simply watched the fireless stone fireplace, as if flames might appear through optimism alone. Then Nolan asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you ever wonder why neither of us ever stayed in a relationship very long?" I blinked. That is an oddly specific midnight conversation. Storms make people honest. I looked toward the rain-soaked windows. Maybe. He leaned back against the couch cushion. Every woman I dated eventually said the same thing. Which was? He scratched the back of his neck, suddenly looking almost embarrassed. They always told me I was somewhere else even when I was sitting right beside them. I frowned. That does not sound like you. It does when enough people say it. His voice stayed calm, but something thoughtful settled behind his eyes. I always cared about them. I really did. But somehow it never felt like I was where I was supposed to be. I turned my mug slowly between both hands. That sounds lonely. It was. Silence rested comfortably between us for several seconds before he looked at me. What about you? I laughed quietly. Mine were easier to explain. How so? I kept comparing everyone to someone they could never become. Nolan tilted his head. Who? The question landed softly, but my heart stumbled anyway. I stared into the lantern light dancing across the coffee table. If I answered honestly, everything would change. So I chose the safer truth. Home. He looked puzzled. Home. I guess I was always looking for the feeling of being completely comfortable with somebody. The kind where silence never feels awkward and you never have to pretend to be anyone else. I shrugged. Nobody ever felt like that. Nolan's expression softened in a way I had never seen before. He lowered his voice until it almost blended with the rain. I have. My eyes lifted to meet his. You have. He nodded once. Only once. The room suddenly felt very still despite the storm raging outside. I waited, but he did not seem in any hurry to fill the silence. Finally I asked, almost afraid of the answer, what did it feel like? Nolan smiled, though it carried more honesty than amusement this time. Like I was already home before I even walked through the front door. Something in my chest tightened. My heartbeat became strangely loud, as though the entire cabin could hear it. He looked at me with complete sincerity and added, "I have never told anyone that before." I opened my mouth, searching for a response clever enough to hide everything I was feeling, but nothing came. Outside, lightning flashed silently across the mountains, briefly bathing the room in pale white light before fading away again. For just a heartbeat, I could have sworn Nolan was looking at me differently than he ever had before, not as the friend who had shared half his life with me, but as someone searching for an answer he had been carrying much longer than either of us realized. Another roll of thunder swept across the mountains, deeper this time, lingering long enough to make every window hum softly inside its frame. The lantern flickered once, recovered, and filled the room with its steady golden glow again. Neither of us moved. Nolan's words still lingered between us like the warmth trapped beneath the blanket. Home. The word echoed louder than the storm ever could. I looked down at my hands, suddenly fascinated by the faded plaid pattern woven into the blanket across my lap. It was easier than meeting his eyes. Much easier than asking the question that had quietly taken over every corner of my mind. Before I could gather the courage, another flash illuminated the cabin so brightly that shadows vanished for the briefest moment. The thunder followed almost immediately. My body reacted before my pride had a chance to intervene. I flinched hard enough that my shoulder bumped against Nolan's. Without hesitation, without asking, and without making it feel like a dramatic gesture, Nolan wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders. It was simple, natural, almost instinctive. "Easy," he said softly. "It is just passing through." His voice carried the same calm certainty he used whenever he explained how bridges stayed standing or why buildings survived earthquakes. Somehow it worked even better on people than it did on concrete. I stayed completely still. Part of me wanted to pull away out of embarrassment. Another part, one I had spent years pretending did not exist, wanted time itself to stop moving. "Is this okay?" Nolan asked after a few quiet seconds. I swallowed carefully before answering. "Yes." The word barely rose above a whisper. He did not tighten his arm or make the moment awkward by saying anything else. He simply stayed there beside me, warm, steady, and impossibly familiar. Outside, rain continued drumming against the roof with relentless rhythm, but inside the cabin everything felt strangely peaceful. I could hear the quiet ticking of Nolan's watch whenever he shifted slightly. I could smell the cedar scent from his flannel shirt mixed with the faint aroma of black tea. Little details I had probably noticed 1,000 times before suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. "You know," Nolan said after a long silence, "I think this is the first time you have ever let someone see you scared." I laughed quietly, though it sounded more honest than amused. I usually do a better job hiding it. "I know." I looked up. "You knew?" He smiled without looking at me. "Caleb, I have known you since you wore sneakers with flames on the sides because you thought they made you run faster." I groaned. "Please erase that memory." "Never." His grin widened. "I also remember you pretending you were not afraid every 4th of July while secretly counting the seconds between fireworks." My jaw dropped. "You noticed that?" "I noticed more than you think." Something about the way he said it settled quietly inside my chest. Not dramatic, not romantic, simply true. The realization left me unexpectedly emotional. I had spent so much energy hiding little pieces of myself that I never stopped to consider someone might have been gently protecting those pieces all along. Another low rumble rolled through the valley, but this time I barely reacted. My breathing had slowed without me realizing it. Nolan's arm remained loosely around my shoulders, never demanding, never assuming, simply offering reassurance as though it had always belonged there. Minutes slipped by unnoticed. We talked about nothing in particular after that. Childhood summers. My grandfather's impossible fishing stories. The diner outside Asheville that still served pie the size of dinner plates. Ordinary conversations wrapped around an extraordinary silence neither of us wanted to disturb. At some point, I realized the storm had stopped feeling like something to survive. It had become an excuse to remain exactly where we were. I glanced toward the dark windows one more time before quietly admitting something I had never expected to say aloud. "I think I would have had a much harder night if you had not come with me." Nolan looked at me with a softness that reached all the way into his eyes. "Caleb," he said gently, There was never a version of this trip where I was going to let you face it alone. The storm slowly lost its anger, but sleep never came. Every time the rain softened, another distant rumble rolled across the mountains, as though the sky was reminding us it had not completely let go. Nolan's arm still rested comfortably around my shoulders, and somewhere along the way the awkwardness I expected never arrived. Instead, it felt strangely familiar, like discovering a place you somehow knew by heart, even though you had never been there before. I shifted slightly beneath the blanket and glanced toward the dark window. You know what is funny? I asked quietly. What? I spent years convincing myself thunderstorms were the loudest thing in the world. He smiled. And now? I let out a slow breath. Now I think overthinking is louder. That earned a quiet laugh. You have always been an Olympic-level overthinker. You are not exactly carefree yourself. Fair enough. We sat in silence again, but this one felt different from every silence we had ever shared before. It no longer belonged to two friends simply passing the time. It carried questions that neither of us seemed brave enough to ask. Finally, I turned toward him. Can I ask you something? Always. Earlier, I hesitated, searching for words that would not accidentally change everything. When I grabbed your arm, and later when you put your arm around me, why did you not let go? Nolan looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. The lantern reflected softly across his face, making his expression almost impossibly gentle. Because I did not want to. The answer was so simple that it left no room for misunderstanding. My heartbeat stumbled. I waited for him to smile or laugh or say he was joking, but he did none of those things. He simply kept looking at me with quiet honesty. You could have, I whispered. I know. It would have been easier. He shook his head. Not for me. Something inside me gave way all at once, not painfully, but quietly, like snow slipping from a tree branch after carrying too much weight. 15 years of carefully choosing the safe words suddenly felt exhausting. I looked down at my hands. I have been afraid of ruining this friendship for a very long time. Nolan's expression changed ever so slightly. Ruining it how? I laughed nervously. There it is. What? The question I hoped you would never ask. My throat tightened. Every instinct told me to change the subject, to make another joke, to talk about weather forecasts or fishing poles or literally anything else. Instead, I surprised myself. Have you ever noticed, I said quietly, that every important memory I have somehow includes you? Nolan did not answer. He simply listened. When something good happened, you were the first person I wanted to call. When something fell apart, you were already knocking on my door before I even asked for help. Somewhere along the way, I stopped and closed my eyes for a brief second. Somewhere along the way, I forgot where friendship ended and something else quietly began. The room became so still that even the rain seemed to pause outside. I could not bring myself to look at him again. I never said anything because losing you would have hurt more than pretending. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Then I felt Nolan gently squeeze my shoulder. Not tightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to know he was still there. Caleb, he said softly, look at me. I finally did. His eyes held no surprise, no discomfort, no confusion. Only relief. A small, almost disbelieving smile appeared on his face. Do you really think you were the only one trying to hide something all these years? Morning arrived so quietly that at first I thought I had imagined it. The rain had faded into an occasional drip from the roof, and pale golden light slowly filtered through the curtains, replacing the warm glow of the lantern that had kept us company all night. I blinked toward the window, almost surprised to find the world still there. The mountains stood washed clean beneath a sky that looked incapable of making the promises it had broken only hours earlier. Nolan had not moved very much. We were still sitting beneath the heavy blanket, his arm resting comfortably around my shoulders, as though neither of us had wanted to be the first person to disturb whatever had quietly changed between us. He noticed me looking outside and smiled. Looks like we survived. I laughed softly. I was never worried about surviving the storm. He raised an eyebrow. No, I was worried about surviving this conversation. His smile grew warmer. How are you doing so far? I thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. Better than I expected. Nolan slowly let his arm fall away, not because he wanted distance, but because daylight somehow made everything feel wonderfully real instead of uncertain. He stood, stretched, and walked toward the window. Roads will probably still be wet, he said. We should wait another hour before driving back. Good plan. I watched him pull the curtain aside. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, revealing tiny dust particles floating lazily through the air. The cabin looked completely different now. Last night it had felt isolated from the world. This morning it simply felt peaceful. Nolan turned back toward me. Can I tell you something? You already have a pretty impressive lead. He chuckled. I almost said something years ago. My heart skipped again. After your photography exhibit in Asheville. I remembered that night immediately. We had celebrated with burgers from a roadside diner because I insisted expensive restaurants made me nervous. We had laughed all the way back to my apartment, and before getting out of the truck, I had almost asked him to stay a little longer. Almost. Why did you not? I asked quietly. Nolan leaned one shoulder against the window frame. Because you looked happy. I convinced myself you deserved someone better than a guy who spent most weekends talking about bridge inspections. I covered my face with one hand and laughed. That is honestly the worst reason I have ever heard. I know. You should have said something. You should have too. We looked at each other for a second before laughing at the same time. The kind of laughter that only comes after realizing two people have spent years making exactly the same mistake. The weight that had quietly followed us through birthdays, road trips, holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays suddenly seemed almost unbelievable. So much time had been lost simply because both of us had been trying to protect the other. Nolan stepped closer again, stopping within easy reach, but giving me every chance to move away if I wanted. I did not. So, he asked softly, where do we go from here? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I honestly have no idea. Good. He smiled back. Neither do I. Somehow that answer felt perfect. For the first time since we were 12 years old, neither of us was pretending to know exactly what came next. We simply knew we wanted to find out together. Outside, sunlight continued spilling across the mountain ridge, melting away the last traces of the storm. Inside the old cabin, surrounded by memories of the past, it quietly felt as though something entirely new had finally begun. 1 week later, the mountain storm already felt like something that belonged to another lifetime. Yet I carried pieces of that night with me everywhere. Every photograph I edited somehow reminded me of the sunlight breaking through the cabin windows. Every cup of coffee tasted a little different because I no longer reached for my phone wondering whether I should text. Nolan first. I simply did. Nothing between us had become rushed or dramatic. We had not tried to force 15 years of friendship into a single week of impossible expectations. Instead, we did what we had always done. We spent time together. We laughed. We argued over where to get lunch. We watched terrible movies and made even worse jokes. The only difference was that neither of us pretended our smiles meant less than they did. Late Friday afternoon, Nolan called and asked if I could stop by after work. His voice carried that familiar calm confidence, but there was something else underneath it that I could not quite place. When I pulled into his driveway just outside Charlotte, he was already waiting on the porch with both hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. You look suspicious, I said as I climbed the steps. I have been accused of worse. Should I be concerned? Probably not. He reached into his pocket and held out a small set of keys resting on a simple silver key ring. I stared at them for a second before looking back at him. What are those? Come with me. He led me around the side of the house to a quiet little street where a recently renovated craftsman home stood beneath 2 large maple trees. It was not enormous or extravagant. It simply felt welcoming. Fresh white trim framed the windows, flower boxes sat beneath the front porch, and the late afternoon sunlight made the whole place glow softly against the autumn sky. Nolan placed the keys gently into my hand. I signed the papers yesterday. I blinked in confusion. You bought a house? He nodded. I have been planning it for months. I looked from the keys to the front door. Congratulations. He smiled, but instead of taking the keys back, he closed my fingers around them. There is one more thing. My heart began beating a little faster. What? He took a slow breath. That night at your grandfather's cabin, you said you had spent years looking for the feeling of home. I remembered every word. I did. I kept thinking about that. His blue eyes never left mine. Then I realized I was searching for exactly the same thing. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the sidewalk. Life continued as ordinary as ever, yet nothing about this moment felt ordinary. Nolan smiled with the same quiet warmth that had carried me through the longest night of my life. This house is wonderful, he said softly. But it is only a building unless the person who makes it feel like home is willing to walk through the front door with me. My vision blurred before I even realized my eyes had filled with tears. I laughed at myself, wiping them away with the back of my hand. You know, I managed. For an engineer, you have become surprisingly good with words. He laughed too. I had a very patient photographer teaching me about feelings. Before either of us could overthink another second, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He hugged me back immediately, holding me with the same quiet reassurance he had offered during the storm. Except this time the sky above us was clear and brilliantly blue. We stood there smiling like two people who had finally stopped running from a destination they had unknowingly been walking toward their entire lives. Sometimes the strongest foundation is not built from concrete or steel. Sometimes it is built from years of trust, countless ordinary days, and one extraordinary night that gives two best friends the courage to finally call the same place home.